Hello, my name is Victoria Orchard, and in coordination with the Geography and Environmental Studies program at the University of St. Thomas, I was able to produce this analysis of urban green space, creating a happier and healthier Twin Cities with green space. It is important to recognize what is hindering us now and what we can change. Things like increasing urbanization, spatial planning policy, densification, and living with less green space have been making it increasingly difficult to build a happier and healthier Twin Cities. Some things that we can change include community health, stress patterns, access to green space, crime rates, and even exercise habits. Biophilia, a term coined by Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, is extremely important to creating happier and healthier cities. Biophilia is the concept that humans have co-evolved with nature and that humans have a need to connect with nature in order to be happy and healthy. E.O. Wilson described biophilia as the innate emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms, innate meaning hereditary and hence part of the ultimate human nature. Biophilic cities, that is, biophilia on a city scale, incorporate green space into everyday activity, show links between physical and mental health benefits associated with the green space, and there's a strong positive relationship between the presence of natural daylight, fresh air, and greenery, with increases in happiness and productivity. In order to build biophilic cities, we need to consider the right community space. The first and second space, being the home, work, and office, is essential for incorporating everyday green features, but the third space, parks, large-scale green space, and spaces available to the community are most important for creating biophilic cities. You might be asking, how does nature affect us? Well, nature combines many positive health benefits with sustainable strategies to create what we call livable neighborhoods with adequate third space. This third space is perfect for adding biophilic design features. Research has shown that people who live closer to parks and/or green space report better mental health, and this is particularly true for parks with a lot of green space. Nature is also essential to human need. In order to create more vibrant and healthy neighborhoods that include biophilic design, nature must be incorporated into the third space. Biophilia in the third space correlates with Maslow's hierarchy of human needs in all these different areas. Environmental psychology has shown that a natural environment has a positive effect on well-being through restoration of stress and attentional fatigue. This concept is called vitamin G. There is a strong relationship between green space and people's living environment and their health, well-being, and feelings of safety, and the additional features that affect these relationships include healthy behavior, social integration, and exposure to vitamin G or green space. All of these concepts helped me to develop my research question. First, I wanted to focus on which areas of the Twin Cities have little to no green space, and of these areas that lack green space, which were vulnerable in terms of walkability, crime, and demographics. Second, I looked at where are the best opportunities to build better neighborhood environments that have the most positive impacts. Crime is essential in determining how people get to and use green space. Here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, I isolated these high crime areas in order to assess crime and crime's role in the other features of the Twin Cities green space. First, I wanted to look at neighborhood green values. As you can see in my model, I use the tree canopy to isolate these neighborhood green values. Where there's green coverage of the land, including trees, shrubs, and fields, you'll see a darker green color. In these red areas, you can see that there's little to no green value. Next, I wanted to focus on distance to water and parks. If you take a look at my model, you can see that I used a generalized land use layer and Euclidean distance to create a map of distance to water and parks. Water is interesting because sometimes it serves as a barrier for walkability. For example, if you're trying to cross the Mississippi, you definitely need a bridge. In other cases, water is equal to parks. For example, if you're going to the Mississippi to enjoy its sheer beauty, it could serve as a park itself. Generally, there is a lack of open water in the center cities, especially in the Twin Cities when we're used to lakes, ponds, and rivers all across the state, and here in the cities it's mostly just a developed landscape. This map is an output of that model. As you can see, the distance to water in parks is described in a green to purple scale, green being very close to a water body or park, and purple being very far. If you look in these high crime areas, you can see that there's a good mix of purple to green, although all these purple areas may not be accessible to green space in any form. When considering distance, one must also consider friction of distance. Friction of distance plays a key role in the way nature influences our day-to-day lives. Factors of friction of distance include physical obstruction, walkability, and crime barriers that can make it harder to access our green spaces. This map, based on the previous model, displays friction of distance on a blue to red scale. Areas with low friction of distance that are conducive to pedestrian modes of travel are in blue, whereas areas with high friction of distance that can make it harder or nearly impossible to access green space are in red. If we take a look at the high crime areas, it's interesting to see the nice blue and red mix, although if we look more specifically at areas known to have high crime like the University Corridor, it's almost entirely red. When looking at green space in the Twin Cities, it's also important to consider vulnerability based on demographics. Those living in poverty, with rent burden, and those without a high school education are most vulnerable to the negative impacts of a lack of green space. These areas represent some of the most poorly funded and managed areas for green space in the Twin Cities. This map, based on the previous model that includes those living in poverty, those with a rent burden, and those without a high school education, displays vulnerability on a blue to red scale. The areas in blue represent areas where people are the least vulnerable, whereas the areas in red represent areas where people are most vulnerable. If we isolate the high crime neighborhoods, it's easy to see that crime and vulnerability are strongly related. Areas with high crime tend to have the most vulnerable people. With all of this data, I wanted to develop a new map to display which areas of the Twin Cities could benefit the most from an incorporation of biophilic design and green space. By combining all three measures of vulnerability in this model, I was able to do that. This resulting map shows those areas in orange. These target areas would have the most positive impacts if we chose to incorporate green space and biophilic design. If we take a look at the high crime areas, you can see that there's plenty of opportunity to incorporate biophilic design and green space where it would matter most. So now what? In order to create a green and healthy city landscape, we must incorporate biophilic design and green space into the most vulnerable areas that were shown in orange. Areas with little to no green space see the biggest positive impacts when introduced, and in order to establish more vibrant and healthy neighborhoods, nature is essential. Given all of this information, it's important to look into the future. Capitalizing on areas that can be retrofitted is essential when space is limited here in the Twin Cities. Providing locals an opportunity to be involved in the development can lead to better outcomes. And finally, and to reiterate, these parks will lead to healthier people, a higher desire to exercise, reducing stress, engaging communities, and uniting neighborhoods. Finally, I wanted to point out the research and data sources that made this presentation possible. Thank you.